In an age when time itself held no meaning yet, at the dawn of humanity, the world was both a home and a merciless adversary. Each sunrise was a victory, each sunset an uncertainty. Now let us listen to the silence of tens of thousands of years ago and witness a day, a lifetime, through the eyes of an average inhabitant of that world, a cave dweller. This is neither the story of kings nor of heroes. This is simply the story of survival. In the depths of the cave, the coldness of stone and the sharp scent of moisture filled the air. The grayness of the outside world revealed itself through the faint light seeping through the cave's mouth. The sun had not yet risen, but night had not fully retreated either. In this in-between time, the clan was slowly awakening. The rubbing of one body against another, a sleepy grunt, a cough from deep within. These were the first sounds of a new day. In the center of the cave, the last embers of the fire from the night glowed faintly as orange dots. Its warmth had almost completely vanished. Only the sooty smell of smoke remained. A young man named Kurg half opened his eyes. The thick animal hides over him had not been enough to ward off the night's chill. He sat up with a shivering sensation that penetrated his bones. When he looked around, he saw his family, his clan. Some were sleeping with their backs against the wall, knees drawn to their chests. Others, like him, had awakened and were silently surveying their surroundings. There was no speaking in these moments. Words were not yet so widespread. Besides, expending energy at this early hour of morning was meaningless. Everyone was gathering their strength for the difficult day about to begin. Kurg looked up at the cave ceiling. On the stone surface blackened by thousands of years of soot and smoke, shadows seemed to dance faintly. This was their home. It was a shelter that protected them from predators, wind, and freezing rain. But at the same time, it was a dark, damp, and always somewhat eerie place. From the deeper parts of the cave came the sound of dripping water, keeping time's monotonous rhythm. Tock, tock, tock. This sound was the oldest thing Kurg knew. His mother had slept listening to this sound. His father had awakened to it. Now it was his turn. He slowly stood up. His muscles had stiffened. Every movement reminded him of the previous day's fatigue. He took a few steps toward the cave's mouth. The air outside was even colder and cleaner. The first breath he drew into his lungs cut through him like an icy blade. The sky was a pale violet color. The horizon glowed with a faint brightening that heralded the imminent arrival of the sun. All around was a deep silence. Neither a bird's call nor an animal's bellow. Only the howling of the wind and the sound of his own breath. This silence was both peaceful and frightening, because silence could also be the harbinger of danger. His eyes scanned the surrounding terrain. The silhouettes of trees stood like frozen giants. The distant hills were shrouded in night's last darkness. He was looking for any movement, any unusual situation. This was every morning's first and most important ritual, to check whether they were alive and whether they were safe. A few more people joined him from behind. No one said a word. They just stood and listened to the world. This was their grammarless prayer, their wordless morning meeting. The day was about to begin, and no one knew what today would bring. Perhaps a hunt, perhaps hunger, perhaps security, perhaps an attack. Life was like a pendulum swinging between these two possibilities, and they had to be prepared for each swing of that pendulum. Kurg returned to the cave. He went to the fire. Soon, one of the day's most important tasks would begin: reviving the fire. This was a vital step not just for warmth, but also to drive away darkness, keep predators at bay, and cook their food. A cold awakening was always the harbinger of a difficult day. The ashes in the center of the cave were nothing more than a gray dust pile. But deep within this pile, hidden were a few embers that had managed to survive by trembling, even through the darkest and coldest moments of the night. The clan's oldest woman, Ina, whose face was filled with wrinkles like a map of time and hardships, was the keeper of the fire. This duty had been inherited from the clan's previous elder. This was not a task related to strength or hunting. It was a sacred responsibility requiring patience, knowledge, and attention. Ina approached the fire pit with slow and sure steps. She knelt down. She placed her hands over the ashes, but she didn't touch them. She was just trying to feel where the warmth was still concentrated. Her eyes were almost closed. This was her silent dialogue with the fire. The others watched her from a respectful distance. Without fire, there would be no clan. Fire was their heart. As long as it beat, they were alive. When it stopped, they would perish, freezing or starving. Ina had prepared a small pile of dry grasses and tree bark beside her. These were the most easily flammable materials, carefully collected daily by the clan's women. The wrong material, a damp leaf for instance, could extinguish that precious ember. Ina began to gently rake the ashes with a wooden stick. Each movement was measured. It was as gentle as if trying to wake a sleeping baby. Finally, beneath the ashes, she found that small orange jewel glowing faintly. A momentary whisper of joy spread through the clan. That small glimmer was the hope of a new day. Ina wasted no time and carefully placed the finest, driest grasses on the ember. Then, gathering all her strength, she bent down and began to blow all the air from her lungs in a gentle but continuous flow toward the grass. Her face was illuminated by the ember's light. Her wrinkles deepened even more. This was a ritual she had repeated every morning for years. At first, a feeble smoke began to rise. The smell of smoke mingled with the cave's damp air. Ina continued to blow. Her eyes were burning, but she didn't stop. The others held their breath and waited. Then that magical moment arrived. A small, trembling flame rose from amid the smoke. That small tongue, dancing in yellow and orange colors, was literally trying to cling to life. Ina added slightly thicker kindling pieces on top of the flame. The flame began to hungrily lick at this new fuel. Crackling sounds were heard. The sound of fire broke the silence in the cave. As the flames grew, the inside of the cave began to brighten. The shadows on the walls came to life, began to move, to change shape. The cave's cold stones slowly began to warm with the fire's heat. People approached the fire one by one. They reached their hands toward the fire and savored that life-giving warmth. This was the day's first comfort. The fire's rebirth was not just a physical event, it was also a spiritual relief. Fire was their protector. A burning branch placed at the cave's mouth would prevent a curious predator from entering at night. Fire made hard roots edible. It killed the diseases within meat. Fire heated the flint used for making tools, making it easier to shape. And perhaps most importantly, fire brought people together. At night they would gather around it, tell the day's events. They would see each other's faces, feel that they were a clan. Kurg sat across from the fire, watching the dance of the flames. He could feel the fire's power and fragility simultaneously. They had to feed these flames, protect them, and carry them to the next day. The fire going out meant disaster. That's why someone was always on fire watch. The fire's fuel wood must never run out. Ina withdrew with the peace of having completed her duty. Now it was the young people's turn. A few young men began carrying larger pieces of wood to the fire. The fire had begun to burn vigorously. The inside of the cave was now a safer, warmer, and brighter home. The fire's heart had begun to beat for another day. For the clan members gathered around the fire's warmth, the day's first meal generally consisted of leftovers from the previous day. This morning there wasn't much to go around. The bones left from a small deer hunted a few days ago were being reheated over the fire. The aim was to melt the last particles of marrow inside the bones and not waste that precious fat. Everyone's share was to lick the bone for a while, or crack it with a stone tool and suck out the tiny bit of marrow inside. This was more an action to silence the stomach for a while than a feast. Kurg was examining the bone in his hand. There was almost no meat left on it. He brought the bone close to the fire and waited for it to warm up a bit more. Then he struck the bone's weakest point with a sharp piece of flint. The bone split in two with a crack. The marrow inside was a fatty pinkish layer. Kurg scraped it off with his finger and brought it to his mouth. The taste was intense, oily, but far from satisfying. This was the taste of scarcity. Every morsel reminded them of how important the next hunt was. The women gave priority to the children. A small child eagerly sucked the marrow from the bone his mother had broken while his mother watched him patiently. She seemed to have forgotten her own hunger. The clan's continuity depended on the children's survival, and everyone knew this unwritten rule. Food wasn't just for filling stomachs, it was also a social glue. When there was food, it was shared. The best parts went to the hunters and pregnant women. The elderly received their share for serving the clan with their experience and knowledge. But when there was no food, this order turned into a silent tension. Stomach rumblings spoke louder than unspoken words. During times of scarcity, what the gatherers brought became even more important. The edible roots, hard-shelled nuts, and even insect larvae that the women collected, though they couldn't replace meat, provided the necessary energy to survive. A few roots collected yesterday had been buried among the embers. Now a woman was raking the embers with a sharpened stick, pulling out the roots that were charred on the outside and softened on the inside. When the skin was peeled, the starchy part that emerged had a smoky, earthy taste. Kurg took his share. He chewed slowly. The taste wasn't very pleasant, but the weight he felt in his empty stomach prevented him from complaining. His eyes were on the clan's leader, Boar. Boar was an experienced hunter. The scars on his face were proof of countless hunts and struggles. He too was silently eating his food, but his eyes were constantly on the clan members. He was trying to figure out who was hungrier, who was weaker. Soon he would gather the hunting group and set out to put an end to this scarcity. The day's plan was made not with words, but with gestures and habits. A glance from Boar would determine which hunters would go with him. The young and strong were chosen. Kurg was one of them. This was both an honor and a heavy responsibility. Failure meant not just his own hunger, but the entire clan's hunger. When this meal that couldn't be called breakfast ended, only empty bones and root peels remained. Everyone had to face the uncertainty of the next meal. This situation motivated them even more, rather than making them lazy. Hunger was the most powerful whip. Kurg returned to his place to check his spear and stone axe. He made sure the sharpened stone at the spear's tip was securely attached. He checked the axe's sharpness. These tools were his survival instruments. Without them, he too would become prey. The rest of the clan was also preparing for their duties. While the women prepared their leather bags for gathering, an old man had begun to chip flintstones to make new tools. Everyone had a role, and the harmony of these roles ensured the smooth operation of the clan's survival machine. As the day's first lights illuminated the cave more, the silence brought by scarcity was slowly giving way to the murmurs of preparation. Boar rose from beside the fire and walked toward the cave's mouth. This movement was the official beginning of the day. Speech occupied only a small place in the clan's communication. Their language included a few basic sounds, grunts, and shouts. There were certain sounds for basic concepts like danger, come, go, food. But the real communication was established through body language, gestures, and facial expressions. This was an instinctive and learned dance that had been passed down from generation to generation for thousands of years. Boar turned around to select the hunting group. His eyes wandered over the young and vigorous men. He looked at Kurg and gestured outside with his head. It meant, "You're coming." Then he made the same gesture to two other experienced hunters. The disappointment on the face of a young hunter who wasn't chosen was barely visible, but no one questioned the leader's decisions. Boar's experience was one of the clan's most valuable assets. His intuition told him where the hunt would be found, what the weather would be like, and which risks were worth taking. Among the women, too, there was a similar silent communication. An old woman pointed to a nearby valley with her hand to a young girl. This meant, "We're going to that area today. There might be ripe blackberries there." The young girl nodded to indicate she understood. A mother gently touched her small child's shoulder, calling him to her side. The child immediately stopped playing and ran to his mother's side. There was both love and authority in that touch. Communication wasn't just between people. Clan members also had to read nature's language. A broken branch could be a sign of a large animal passing nearby. The sudden silence of birds could indicate the presence of a nearby predator. The wind's direction could bring them the scent of prey, or carry their scent to the prey. That's why everyone constantly listened, smelled, and observed their surroundings. This was a fundamental rule of survival. As the hunting group prepared to leave the cave, a farewell ritual took place between them and those staying behind. Spouses touched each other's arms. Mothers stroked the shoulders of sons going hunting. In these touches were hidden wishes that couldn't be put into words like, "Be careful, be strong," come back. Emotions that couldn't be expressed in words were conveyed much more powerfully through these simple gestures. Kurg took his spear in hand. His father, Gard, who was now too old to hunt, came to his side. He placed his hand on Kurg's shoulder and squeezed. He looked into his eyes. In this gaze was a father's pride, concern, and trust in his son. Kurg responded to his father with a nod. This meant, "Don't worry, I can do it." There was no need for another word between them. Everything had been understood in this silent moment. The old man considered the clan's shaman or sorcerer, touched a painted stone in his hand to each of the hunters. This was a ritual for a bountiful hunt and the hunter's safe return. No one knew how this worked, but they had learned it from their ancestors. This ritual gave them spiritual strength and confidence. In a world full of uncertainty, such rituals served as anchors. Finally, Boar in front, the other 3 hunters behind, they left the cave in single file. Their steps were silent and determined. The clan remaining behind watched them until they disappeared from sight. Then they too returned to their own tasks. These separations were a part of life. Each separation carried the risk of never seeing each other again. But this risk had to be taken to survive. The silent language was the strongest bond holding the clan together. Disagreements were also resolved this way. Tension between 2 men would begin with harsh looks and threatening postures, generally ending with one backing down. Satisfaction during sharing was expressed with a smile or a grateful nod. This silent world had a network of meaning far deeper and more complex than modern humans could understand. Every movement, every look, every silence had a meaning, and understanding this language was equivalent to living. A little way from the cave, the clan's old craftsman Erg had begun one of the day's most important tasks. Beside him stood a pile of flint stones of different sizes and shapes. Erg's job was to give these lifeless stone pieces a purpose, a soul. He was a tool maker, and this was one of the most respected roles within the clan. Without their spears, hunters couldn't do their jobs. Without cutting tools, women couldn't do theirs. Erg was the clan's hands and teeth. Erg took a fist-sized flint with a smooth surface into his hand. He turned the stone over in his palm. He felt its weight, its texture. He closed his eyes and tried to see the potential tool within the stone. Each stone had its own unique structure, its own grain. A master sculptor would know how to strike the stone, where to apply force. A wrong strike could shatter the stone into pieces and waste hours of labor. Erg placed a larger, harder stone between his knees as an anvil. He placed the flint in his hand on top of this anvil. In his other hand, he had a hammer made from deer antler. He took a deep breath and struck the first blow. The tack sound echoed in the morning air. A small piece flew off the stone. Erg examined the result. It was a break just as he wanted. This work required sensitivity and rhythm rather than brute force. Strike, examine, turn the stone, strike again. Each blow was made while planning the next. This was an art that had become instinctive after thousands of repetitions. Erg's hands were proof of this work. Thickened, calloused, and full of countless small cut marks. But his fingers moved with surprising agility. They were literally dancing on the stone. Slowly, the round stone began to change shape. While one edge thinned and sharpened, the other side was rounded to fit comfortably in the hand. Erg was making a hand axe. This was one of the clan's most used tools. It was used for many tasks such as cutting trees, breaking bones, and skinning hides. After a few hours of work, the axe's rough shape had emerged. Now came the most delicate part, sharpening the edges. Erg put down the antler hammer and picked up a softer wooden percussion tool. With this tool, he delivered small controlled blows to the axe's edge, breaking off tiny particles. This process was called pressure flaking, and it produced an edge as sharp as a razor. A few young people sitting beside Erg watched him carefully. This was their education. While the master worked, the apprentices watched him. They memorized his movements. There was no such thing as learning by talking. Learning was entirely based on observation and imitation. One of the youths picked up one of the pieces Erg had struck off and tried to chip it himself. But with his first blow, he broke the stone. Disappointment appeared on his face. Erg only looked at him for a moment. There was neither anger nor mockery in this look. Just wisdom saying you need to try more. This art required patience. When Erg finished the axe, he picked up his work and examined it. The edge was smooth and sharp enough to reflect light. It fit perfectly in his palm. Its balance was right. This was no longer just a piece of stone. This was the product of a will created for a purpose. The stone's soul had awakened in Erg's hands. Throughout the day, Erg continued to make different tools. Flat and curved scrapers used for scraping hides, knives for cutting meat, and new spear points waiting for the hunters to return. Each tool was designed for a specific need. These tools were the most important inventions that compensated for humanity's weakness against nature. They had no claws, but they had sharp stones. They had no thick fur, but they had tools to process animal hides and make clothing. They couldn't run fast, but they had spears they could throw far. Erg's work wasn't just chipping stone, it was also laying the foundation of civilization. When the sun climbed to its zenith, a bunch of new tools had accumulated around Erg. He was tired but satisfied with his work. These tools would help his clan survive for another day. He finished a tool and set it aside, and before starting a new one, he paused for a moment and looked into the distance, toward the direction the hunters had gone. He hoped they too would succeed in their tasks with these tools. Shortly after the hunters left the cave, the clan's women and children also set out for their own duties. Their hunting ground wasn't the distant and dangerous plains like the men's, but the forests, meadows, and riverbanks around the cave. They were after the small but reliable blessings the earth offered. Their leader was usually Anja, one of the clan's most experienced women. Anja could tell at a glance which plant was edible and which was poisonous. She knew which root was most nutritious in which season, when which fruits ripened. This knowledge was a thousands of years old heritage passed from her mother to her, and from her to her daughter. The group plunged into the forest without going too far from the cave. The children were joyfully running around, bending down to examine everything they found interesting, imitating their mothers. Though this seemed like a game to them, it was actually the most important education of their lives. They were learning this way which leaf's texture was different, which insect was harmless. Anya stopped the group in front of a bush. She bent the branches and showed the small red berries underneath. These were sweet and juicy berries resembling wild strawberries. Everyone began carefully collecting these berries into their leather bags. Small fingers gently plucked the berries without crushing them. Every now and then they didn't refrain from popping a few into their mouths. This was the day's first sweet reward. Gathering wasn't an instant and exciting activity like hunting. It required patience, attention, and a wide knowledge base. The women not only collected fruit, but also dug the earth. Using their sharpened sticks, they searched for nutritious roots and tubers. One woman began digging at the base of a particular plant. After several minutes of effort, she pulled out a starchy root resembling a potato. Though this wasn't as nutritious as meat, it was an important carbohydrate source that would save the clan from starvation. Another important part of gathering was finding protein sources. This didn't always mean large animals. Nutritious insect larvae under a rotting log, ants in tree bark, or slow-moving snails were easily obtained valuable proteins. These foods that might be repulsive to modern humans were part of survival for them. Children especially loved this task. When they lifted a rock and caught the insects that came out from underneath, it was like a hunting game for them. Anya moved toward the riverbank. Here they were looking for the roots of certain types of reeds that grew at the water's edge. It was also an opportunity to catch slow-swimming fish or shellfish in the river. Two young women waded into the shallow water and tried to herd small fish to the shore with a kind of net they made with their hands. Their efforts resulted in a few small fish. This wasn't a great success, but it was better than nothing. The group not only collected food, but also searched for other important materials. Dry kindling and fungi for making fire, dry grasses and mosses for making beds, plant fibers and animal sinews that could be used to tie tool handles. Nature was their supermarket, and everything had a use. A tree's resin could be used to attach a spear point to its shaft. Certain leaves could serve as bandages to wrap wounds. Anya and the other experienced women also knew the secrets of this natural pharmacy. By midday, their bags were half full. But this wasn't always easy. Sometimes after hours of searching, they could return empty-handed. The earth wasn't always generous. Drought could wither plants, heavy rains could rot fruits. That's why they appreciated everything they found. This constant search gave them the opportunity to establish a deep connection with their environment. They knew the cycle of seasons, the growth stages of plants, and the habits of animals better than anyone. They were like a living encyclopedia of the land they inhabited. As the sun began to set, the gathering group set out on the return journey to the cave. They were tired, but their hands were full. What they brought was the clan's insurance in case the hunters failed. Their silent and patient efforts were as vital as the hunters' seemingly heroic struggle. The Earth's generosity was the invisible but fundamental pillar of the clan's survival. The hunt. Kurg and the other 3 hunters were advancing silently in single file after leaving the cave. In front walked Boar, the clan's leader and most experienced hunter. His steps were the confident steps of someone who knew every bump and hollow of the terrain by heart. His eyes were in constant motion. He was scanning the ground, the trees, the sky. He wasn't just walking, he was reading the world around him. Kurg was right behind Boar. He was trying to imitate his every movement. Wherever he placed his foot, he placed his there too. This way they made less noise and left fewer tracks. This was one of the first lessons a young hunter had to learn: to be invisible and inaudible. Hunting was more a game of intelligence and patience than a show of strength. The hunters' targets were animals much larger, stronger, and faster than themselves. Woolly mammoths, steppe bison, wild horses. Entering into a head-to-head struggle with these animals would be suicide. The key to success was ambushing, surprising the animal and catching its weak moment. That's why the journey to the hunt, the tracking and approach process, was more important than the hunt itself. The group's route wasn't aimed at a specific target. Boar made decisions based on the wind's direction, tracks on the ground, and his own instincts. They always had to keep the wind facing them. Otherwise, the human scent could warn animals from kilometers away. After walking for a while, Boar suddenly stopped. He pointed to the ground with his hand. The others also crouched beside him and looked where he was pointing. In the mud was a large and deep track. It was a bison track. The track was fresh. Its edges hadn't yet dried. Boar checked the track's depth with his fingers. He was trying to get an idea about the animal's weight. Then he examined the other tracks around. This track didn't belong to a single animal. It belonged to a small herd. This was good news. A herd meant more targets and more hunting chances. But at the same time, the herd also had more eyes and ears. This made approaching more difficult. Boar stood up and thought for a moment, looking in the direction the track went. Then he made his decision and began advancing in that direction. The hunt had begun. Now they had to be even more silent and careful. As they advanced, they analyzed every detail around them. A broken branch could show how hurried the animal was. Fresh dung dropped on the ground was a sign of how close they were. Even the chirping of birds carried meaning. This was a science intertwined with nature, not put into words. Kurg gripped his spear tightly. His heart was beating with a mixture of excitement and fear. Every hunt was a life-and-death struggle. A successful hunt meant the clan would stay fed for weeks. Failure meant hunger, and there was always risk. A wounded bison could easily kill a hunter. That's why each hunter was responsible for both his own life and his companions' lives. They walked for hours. The sun had climbed to its zenith. Fatigue and thirst were beginning to make themselves felt, but no one complained. This was part of the hunter's path. Mental and physical endurance was as important a weapon as a spear. The terrain they were advancing through began to change. The wooded area gave way to a wide, open steppe. This was both good and bad. It was easier to see animals in the open area, but there was little place to hide. Boar pulled them behind a group of rocks. From here they could easily see the valley, and there they were. A herd of about 10 or 15 bison was peacefully grazing. Among them were a few young and old animals. Boar's eyes caught on an old male bison that had separated slightly from the herd and was limping. That was the ideal target. It had separated from the herd. It was slow and probably less alert. Boar told the others his plan with gestures. They would silently approach the animal from different directions, also taking the wind into account. The aim was to drive it further from the herd, toward a place where they could corner it. The plan was simple, but its execution would be deadly difficult. The hunters separated from behind the rocks and began advancing by crawling among the grasses on the ground. The hunter's path had brought them one step closer to their target. Now everything depended on their patience, their courage, and their ability to seize a momentary opportunity. The bison herd continued grazing peacefully, unaware of the hunter's presence. For the hunters, the most critical moments had begun. Now every movement, every sound, every scent could determine the hunt's fate. According to Boar's plan, the four hunters had separated from each other, dispersing in different directions to surround their target, the old bison, in a semicircle shape. This was a slow and agonizing advance. They were crawling on the ground, hiding behind tall grasses and small bushes. Every few meters they would stop and measure the herd's reaction. A head suddenly rising, an ear twitching could mean everything was over. Kurg was advancing, crawling on his belly. His face was rubbing against the ground and grasses. The rustling of dry grasses sounded like thunder to his own ear. He was trying to keep his breathing as silent as possible. He could feel his heart's pounding against his ribcage. This was that primal excitement that hunting brought. He didn't take his eyes off the target for even a moment. The old bison was standing alone, a little away from the others. The injury in his hind leg was apparent with every step. Though this made him an easy target, Kurg still felt respect for the animal. It was a powerful being that had survived for years, weathered countless dangers. Hunting it wasn't just obtaining a food source. It also meant incorporating its strength and spirit into the clan. Wind was the most important ally, and at the same time the greatest enemy in this approach process. The hunters were constantly making sure the wind was blowing from behind them, that is, toward the bison. If the wind changed direction and carried their scent to the herd, everything would end in seconds. Boar turned his face to the sky and watched the movement of clouds, trying to predict the wind's next move. Wind also carried sounds. It could whisper to them the roar of a distant predator or the rustling of a nearby danger. Hunters hunted not just with their eyes but also with their ears and noses. The sounds the bison made while grazing, the smell of earth, the moisture in the air, all of these were signs giving them information about their surroundings. Kurg felt a thorn piercing his hand as he advanced. He grimaced with pain but didn't make a single sound. Pain was a luxury emotion during a hunt. He had to learn to ignore it. If his attention wandered, he could make a mistake. And in this world, a mistake generally meant death. After about an hour of this crawling phase, the hunters had taken their positions. The bison they had targeted was now between them. The nearest hunter was within spear-throwing distance, but they hadn't attacked yet. They were waiting for the right moment. The bison's most vulnerable moment, that brief instant when it would lower its head to drink water or completely turn its back. Boar slowly raised his hand. This was the get-ready signal. Everyone gripped their spears tightly. Their muscles were taut like drawn bows. Adrenaline was coursing through their veins. Kurg looked at the sharp flint at his spear's tip. Old Urg had made this point. He trusted his craftsmanship. Now it was time to show his own skill. The bison suddenly raised its head as if suspecting something. It looked around. Its huge black eyes scanned the direction where the hunters were hiding. Kurg held his breath. His heart felt like it would stop. If they were noticed, the bison would either flee or attack. In either case, the hunt was over. But the bison, after hesitating for a moment, seemed to decide there was no danger and returned to grazing. The hunters breathed a sigh of relief. This was a waiting period when nerves were extremely taut. The wind was howling gently among the grasses, as if it was whispering something to them, perhaps telling them to be patient, to wait for the right moment. Nature was both offering them prey and teaching them the rules of the hunt. And the most important rule was patience. An impatient hunter meant a hungry hunter. Boar continued to wait patiently. His eyes were following the bison's every movement. He was listening to the wind's whisper, feeling the earth's vibrations. He was no longer just a human. He was part of the surrounding ecosystem, a hunter, a predator. And predators knew how to wait for the right moment to attack. Just as Boar was about to give the attack signal, something unexpected happened. From the other end of the valley, a massive shadow emerged from among the bushes. At first, they couldn't understand what it was, but when the shadow fully emerged from the bushes, the hunter's blood froze. This was a cave bear. much larger, more muscular, and more frightening than a normal brown bear. Its long, curved claws were pounding the ground, and its small eyes were scanning the surroundings. Cave bears were one of the most dangerous predators in the region. They generally traveled alone, but had the power to scatter even a bison herd. The bear's appearance had upset all plans. The bison herd sensed the danger before the hunters did. A few bison began bellowing nervously. The herd suddenly stirred. They stopped grazing and gathered together, taking a defensive position. The old bison they had targeted had also joined them. The hunt was over. Boar lowered his hand, canceling the attack. Now the priority wasn't hunting but surviving. The bear hadn't noticed the hunters yet. Its attention was on the bison herd. It too was after prey, and the hunters had entered its hunting ground. This was an extremely dangerous situation. They had fallen from being hunters to being prey. Boar silently signaled the others to retreat. They had to go back the way they had come, crawling, with the same silence. The slightest sound could draw the bear's attention to them. Kurg slowly moved backward, not taking his eyes off the bear for even a moment. The animal's pure power was mesmerizing. The muscle masses on its shoulders were apparent with every step. He didn't even want to imagine what it would mean to face such a creature. In the clans told stories, there were tragic endings of hunters who encountered cave bears. The retreat was even slower and harder than the way they came. Everyone's nerves were extremely tense. They wanted to get away from there as soon as possible and reach a safe distance. But hurrying would be a fatal mistake. Just then, the youngest and most inexperienced hunter of the group, in panic, caught his foot on a branch. The dry branch broke with a loud crack. The sound echoed in the valley. The bison became even more nervous, while the cave bear suddenly turned its head toward the direction of the sound. Those small black eyes locked directly onto the grassy area where the hunters were hiding. They had been noticed. The bear forgot about the bison for a moment and focused on these new and unexpected guests. Curiously, and somewhat threateningly, it took a few steps toward the direction where the hunters were. It raised its nose to the air, trying to catch their scent. Boar assessed the situation instantly. Running wasn't an option. The bear was much faster than them. Fighting was suicide. Only one option remained: to scare the bear and make it flee. Boar suddenly jumped to his feet. He raised the spear in his hands into the air and shouted with the most powerful sound from his lungs. This was a cry not of fear, but of challenge. The other hunters understood what they had to do. They too stood up and joined Boar, waving their spears and shouting. Their aim was to make themselves appear larger, more numerous, and more dangerous than they were. This was a bluffing technique used by many animals in nature. The cave bear seemed surprised by this sudden and loud reaction. It hesitated for a moment. Humans were unusual adversaries for it. They generally fled from it. These four small creatures standing against it made it uncertain. The few seconds of this tense wait felt like a lifetime to everyone. The bear raised one of its front paws and struck the ground. It growled threateningly but didn't attack. It was doing risk analysis. The bison herd could be easy prey, but it wasn't clear what these strange, noisy creatures would do. Perhaps this fight wasn't worth the wound it would receive. Finally, the bear made its decision. It slowly turned its back and began moving away, growling in the direction it had come from. The hunters continued shouting and waving their spears until the bear disappeared from sight. When the danger passed, they all collapsed to the ground in exhaustion. They had lost the hunt, but they had won their lives. This was another lesson nature had given them. They weren't the only predators on these lands, and there could always be a bigger, stronger, unexpected guest. The danger had passed, but the hunting opportunity had also been lost. The bison herd had long since left the valley in the chaos created by the bear and the hunters. Boar and his team were left empty-handed after hours of tracking and tension. This was one of the biggest disappointments in a hunter's life. The clan was waiting hopefully in the cave for their return. All they had to bring them was the weight of failure and fatigue. Boar crouched on the ground, looking into the distance. On his face were the traces of the responsibility that leadership brought. The clan's hunger was on his shoulders. The other hunters were also silent. No one was talking because there was nothing to say. This was one of those moments when words were insufficient. Kurg was standing, leaning on his spear stuck in the ground. His muscles ached. His mind was tired. That moment when they encountered the cave bear wouldn't leave his mind. They had come face to face with death. They should be grateful to be alive. But the hunter spirit inside him was mourning the lost opportunity. A moment's inattention, the rustling of a dry branch had ruined everything. They would now pay the price of that moment with hunger. After resting for a while, Boar stood up. It was time to go home. But returning empty-handed wasn't an option. The clan needed to eat something at least. Boar looked around. His eyes were searching for smaller prey. Wild rabbits, birds, even large lizards. Anything was better than nothing. The hunters set out again. But this time, instead of the excitement of a big hunt, they were after a small hope. Dividing into smaller groups, they began checking bushes and rock hollows. This was a less glorious but equally important hunt. Kurg dove alone into a group of bushes. He was listening carefully to his surroundings. He heard a rustling. He slowly advanced toward where the sound was coming from. A wild rabbit was eating something among the grasses. Kurg froze where he was. This wasn't a large bison, but it was valuable food for the clan. He slowly raised his spear. This time there was no luxury of making a mistake. He held his breath, took aim, and threw. The spear, after traveling a short path through the air, reached its target exactly. The rabbit collapsed where it was. Kurg quickly ran to its side. When he picked up his prey, he felt a relief. At least they wouldn't return completely empty-handed. The other hunters also achieved similar small successes. One had managed to catch a pair of birds from their nest. Another had hunted a large lizard hiding in a rock hollow. Boar gathered these small catches together. They wouldn't replace a bison, but at least they could fill the stomachs of a few clan members. This wasn't a victory, but it also couldn't be counted as a defeat. This was survival. As the sun began to set, the hunters set out on the return journey to the cave. Their steps weren't as energetic as when they left. Fatigue had settled on their shoulders, but they were still walking. Because they had a home they had to return to, a clan waiting for them. This hunt had taught them another important lesson. Always chasing the big one could sometimes cause them to miss the small opportunities at hand. Sometimes to survive, one had to know how to be content with small victories. They had paid the price of a moment's mistake by losing the big hunt. But by the end of the day, by surviving and returning with the small catches in their hands, they had somehow managed to compensate for the price of that moment. This world was as punishing as it was generous. What mattered was being able to stand up and continue walking after each fall. The hunters were doing exactly that. Though the hunters' return journey was filled with small catches, it was mentally exhausting. But the real physical burden would have begun if they had succeeded in a big hunt. In an imaginary scenario, if they had managed to hunt that bison, the most difficult part of the work would now be beginning. Carrying the spoils to the cave, transporting hundreds of kilos of an animal for kilometers without modern equipment would require tremendous effort. That's why a series of operations would be performed at the hunting site immediately after the hunt. First, Boar and the other experienced hunters would begin butchering the animal using their stone knives and axes. This was a task requiring both anatomical knowledge and practical skill. The first cut would always be made to the abdomen, and the internal organs would be removed. Some of these organs, especially the liver and heart, were extremely nutritious and could be consumed raw right there. This was a kind of ritualistic reward that gave the hunters back the energy they had lost after days of tracking. Then the skinning process would begin. The hide had to be carefully removed in one piece, because it was as valuable as meat. It would be used in making clothing, shelter, and bags. This process required great skill as it needed to be done without tearing the hide. After the hide was skinned, it was time to separate the meat from the bone. The most valuable meat parts, the haunches and back section, would be cut in large pieces. The bones wouldn't be discarded either. Large bones would be set aside to later benefit from their marrow and to make tools. Nothing would be wasted. Every part of an animal was seen as a gift for the clan. All these processes would take hours. The hunters would work in exhaustion, struggling with blood and sweat. Meanwhile, other predators, jackals or hyenas attracted by the scent would begin to gather. Some of the hunters would have to stand guard to keep these uninvited guests away. This also meant an additional element of tension and danger. After butchering the meat, the transportation process would begin. The meat pieces would be carried wrapped in the animal's own hide or covered with large leaves. Sometimes a primitive stretcher made from hide stretched between two long poles would be used. 4 hunters would have to shoulder this load of hundreds of kilos. This wasn't just carrying weight. This meant ensuring the clan's future, children's feeding, the elderly's passage through winter. The weight of the load wasn't just physical, it was also spiritual. The return journey would be much slower and more difficult than the outward journey. Every step would be an ordeal. Muscles would burn, shoulders would ache, breath would run out. They would have to take frequent breaks. Even during these breaks, they would have to be alert against the surrounding predators. The load wasn't just a reward, it was also a responsibility. They had to protect it. Sometimes the hunt would be so big that carrying it all in one trip would become impossible. Then, they would leave part of the hunt there, return to the cave, and bring help. This was risky because by the time they returned, scavengers might have found the hunt, but they had no other choice. Kurg was visualizing all of this in his mind. Today, they hadn't been able to carry this load. The weight on their shoulders was just a few rabbits and birds, but the weight in his mind was much more. He was imagining that sweet fatigue that a successful hunt would bring, the grateful looks of the clan. One day he too wanted to be a leader who brought a massive hunt to his clan like boar. That day he wouldn't complain about the weight on his shoulders. On the contrary, he would be proud, because that weight was the most concrete form of survival and responsibility. As the hunters approached the cave, they were better understanding how valuable even today's small catches were. Though little, they were bringing something. Their loads were light, but they still had hope. The next hunt would be better. It had to be. As the sun prepared to set, leaving orange and purple colors on the horizon, activity began in front of the cave. A young lookout standing guard at the cave entrance noticed 2 groups of silhouettes coming from afar. One from the plain where the hunters had gone, the other from the wooded area where the gatherers had gone. The lookout made a certain sound toward the cave to inform the rest of the clan. This was a signal meaning, they're returning. Everyone in the cave left their work and turned outside. This was one of the day's most important moments. Everyone's fate depended on what was in the hands of these 2 returning groups. Children excitedly watched for their mothers or fathers. The elderly waited with the patience of sages on their faces. They were prepared for both good news and bad news. The gathering group was the first to reach the cave. The faces of the women and children were tired. They were covered in dust and dirt, but the leather bags they carried were full. The collected roots, fruits, and nuts were visible from the bags. This was a good sign. At least tonight no one would go completely hungry. Anya, as the group's leader, showed what they had collected to the clan's elders. This was a kind of report. The elders examined what had been collected and made murmurs indicating their satisfaction. Children hugged their mothers and tried to tell what they had experienced during the day. There was an atmosphere of relief and slight joy in the air. The gatherers' success had somewhat reduced the pressure on the hunters, but everyone's eyes were still on the hunting group coming from the plain. Their steps were slower. They didn't have the weight of a massive hunt on their shoulders. This was obvious even from afar. The hopeful expectation on the cave dwellers' faces slowly gave way to anxious curiosity. Had there been an accident? Were there any injured? When the hunters came to the front of the cave, a deep silence fell. Everyone was trying to read Boar's face. Boar was tired but proud. He placed the few small catches in his hand in the clan's common food area. The other hunters did the same. The pile in the middle consisted of a rabbit, 2 birds, and a lizard. This was the result of 4 hunters' entire day's effort. A whisper of disappointment spread among the clan, but no one said anything accusing the hunters. Everyone knew how difficult and dangerous hunting was. Today luck hadn't been on their side, tomorrow it could be. What mattered was that they had all returned safe and sound. Kurg went to his father's side. His father touched his shoulder. This was a consoling touch, meaning, it doesn't matter, you tried. Kurg lowered his head. He still felt like a failure. Boar moved to the center of the clan. Not with words, but with gestures and sounds, he began to tell what had happened during the day. He told how they found the bison herd, how they approached. Then he suddenly stopped and flinched. He began to imitate a large and frightening thing with his body. He made gestures like extending claws and made a deep, guttural sound. Everyone understood he was telling about a cave bear. Clan members looked at each other fearfully. Now they understood what great danger the hunters had escaped. Boar then showed how they had shouted and made themselves look big to scare away the bear. This narration was like a news bulletin for the clan. They were both learning about the day's events and drawing lessons from the experiences. Young people were learning from these stories what to do when encountering a cave bear. At the end of the day, the two groups had come together again, and the clan had become whole again. Though the hunt had failed, with what the gatherers had brought and the hunters' small catches, they would get through this night too. Most importantly, they were together. In their cave, their safe shelter, they had gathered around the fire. No matter how merciless the outside world was, within these walls they were a family, and this togetherness was their greatest strength. As the day waned and darkness fell, the center of life inside the cave completely shifted to the fire. While the outside world turned into a place filled with invisible dangers, this small circle illuminated by the fire was like a safe island. All members of the clan gathered in a circle formation around the fire. This was the most social time of the day. The hunters and gatherers who had been separated throughout the day were now together again. The day's harvest was being prepared in a common effort. The women cleaned the roots they had collected and buried them among the embers. The small catches the hunters had brought, after their skins were peeled, were threaded onto sharpened sticks and began to be cooked over the fire. The smell of cooking meat filled the inside of the cave. This scent was the most beautiful invitation for hungry stomachs. The food was distributed by the clan's elders. Care was taken to make a fair distribution. Children, pregnant women, and hunters were always given a little more share. This was an unwritten rule put in place to secure the clan's future. Everyone silently ate their share. There was no feast today. Every morsel was valuable. A small piece of rabbit or a cooked root, though not enough to fill the stomach, provided the necessary energy to survive. During the meal, people communicated with each other. This was generally a simple repetition of what had been experienced during the day. One woman was telling about the large mushroom she had found, while another was imitating the snake she had seen. Kurg, while watching the fire's flames, tried to make the young girl sitting beside him laugh by doing the bear imitation in a more exaggerated way. Laughter was a rare luxury in this hard life, and these moments strengthened the bonds between people. After the meal ended, life around the fire continued. These hours were not just for resting, but also for working and learning. Old Erg continued to chip a flint in the fire's light. Young people sat beside him and carefully watched his every movement. A woman was mending a torn leather garment with a bone needle with a hole and thread made from animal sinew. Another was cracking the shells of the nuts she had collected with a stone. Everyone had a task. Idleness was a concept with no place in this world. The children were playing, but even their games were preparations for their future lives. Male children were playing hunting games with each other using small sticks like spears, while female children were feeding their dolls or the stones they had collected, imitating their mothers. Through these games, they were learning social roles and survival skills. The fire's light created dancing shadows on the cave walls. These shadows sometimes turned into frightening figures, sometimes activating the clan's imagination. The clan's storyteller, usually one of the oldest members, would use these shadows to tell the stories of their ancestors. Stories of great hunts, legendary heroes, spirits, and creation. These stories passed the clan's history, culture, and beliefs from generation to generation. Their words were few, but their gestures and tone of voice were enough to make the story come alive. These moments enabled the clan to develop a common identity and sense of belonging. They weren't just a collection of people gathered together. They were a clan sharing a common past and future. Kurg, while listening to these stories, put himself in the place of those great hunters. He was imagining that one day his story too would be told by this fireside. Fire wasn't just a source of heat and light. It was the center of the clan's social life, culture, and memory. They were born around that fire, lived around that fire, and died under that fire's light. As long as the fire burned, the clan too would continue to live. While the social life around the fire continued, a different activity was taking place in a deeper, darker corner of the cave. This was the place the clan considered most sacred. Not everyone could enter this section of the cave. Only the shaman, the wise person believed to communicate with spirits, and a few assistants he chose could enter. Tonight the shaman had also brought Kurg with him. This was a great honor for Kurg. This was a sign that he was no longer seen as a child, but as an adult who could be privy to the clan's secrets. The shaman held in his hand a stone lamp filled with animal fat with a wick inserted. The lamp's trembling light illuminated the walls in the cave's depths, and on those walls was an incredible sight. The walls were covered from end to end with animal paintings. Bison, horses, mammoths, deer, as if a living herd would burst out from within the stone. The paintings were extremely realistic and skillfully made. They had been drawn using red and yellow ochre pigment and black charcoal. The animals' muscle structures, movements, postures were reflected with incredible observational power. Those who made these paintings weren't just artists, they were also master hunters. Kurg had seen these paintings from afar before, but had never had the opportunity to examine them this closely. He was fascinated by the painting's beauty and power. This wasn't just decoration. These paintings were believed to have deep meaning, magic. The shaman brought Kurg in front of a bison painting. He pointed with his finger to the area where the bison's heart would be. In that area were a few lines drawn, as if a spear had been stuck. The shaman began to murmur something with a rhythmic sound from his throat. This was a kind of prayer. According to belief, drawing the spirit of the animal to be hunted on the walls and symbolically hunting it would bring success in the real hunt. This was hunting magic. The painting wasn't just an image of the animal, but also a part of its spirit. Confining the painting to the wall meant gaining control over the animal's spirit. The shaman took some red ochre paint in his hand. He mixed it with a little water in his palm and extended it to Kurg. Kurg understood what he had to do. He dipped his hand in the paint and pressed his palm to the wall, next to the bison painting. The print of his hand was now on the wall. This was an oath that he had participated in the hunt, that he was part of this magic. He had added his own spirit to the clan's common effort. In this silent and dim corner of the cave, time seemed to flow differently. The noise and chaos of the outside world didn't reach here. There was only the lamp's trembling light, the shaman's murmurs, and those silent, powerful spirits on the walls. Kurg also examined the other paintings. In some paintings, there were also human figures with spears in their hands chasing animals. These figures were drawn much more simply than the animals, in stick figure form. Did this show humanity's humility in the face of nature, or that the real focus of the paintings was the animals? It was unknown. But these walls were like a summary of the clan's life. Their lives were built on hunting. Their beliefs were shaped around hunting. Even their art told of hunting. These paintings were also a means of knowledge transfer. Young hunters could learn the anatomy of different animals, their weak points, by looking at these paintings. They could read from these frozen moments how each animal moved, how it attacked. This was one of the world's first textbooks. After the shaman finished the ritual, he turned to Kurg and smiled. This was a rarely seen moment. The shaman was generally a serious and distant person, but tonight he had revealed to the young hunter one of the clan's deepest secrets. As Kurg left this sacred section of the cave, he felt changed. He was no longer just a hunter made of flesh and bone. He was also part of the spirits on the walls, a hunting tradition that had lasted for generations, and the clan's spiritual world. This both placed a great responsibility on him and gave him an indescribable power. When he went out on the next hunt, he would carry not just his spear, but also the power of those ancient spirits on the walls. As life in the clan slowly settled down, the world outside the cave was beginning to come alive. Night was the time of different creatures. Though the fire's light and human scent kept many animals away, for some this could mean an invitation. That's why every night 1 or 2 people from the clan would keep fire watch. This duty was generally given to young and vigorous men. Tonight it was Kurg's turn for watch. After everyone had fallen asleep, Kurg sat in a place close to the cave's mouth. Beside him was a smoking piece of branch, whose tip had been heated red in the embers. This was both a torch and a weapon. In his hand, he also had his spear ready. His duty was simple: keep the fire alive and warn the clan against any danger. The inside of the cave was filled with the regular breathing of sleeping bodies. Every now and then a baby's crying or the murmur of someone talking in their sleep broke this monotony. Kurg looked at his family, his clan. While they slept, he was awake. This made him feel the pride that came from being a protector, but the place he really needed to pay attention to was outside. His eyes were trying to get used to the darkness. The moonlight had painted the surrounding terrain a ghostly silver color. The shadows of trees and rocks looked larger and more threatening than they were. The sounds of night were very different from the sounds of day. The bird chirps and insect buzzes of day were now replaced by more mysterious and eerie sounds. The howling of a hyena pack from afar made his hair stand on end. This sound was the harbinger of death and carrion. The eerie hooting of an owl was heard closer by. A rustling from among the bushes caused Kurg to immediately grip his spear. He looked carefully in the direction of the sound. A few seconds later, he saw a small fox gliding through the shadows. He breathed a sigh of relief. This was a harmless visit, but not every rustling could be so innocent. A cave lion or a saber-toothed tiger could approach with the same silence. That's why he shouldn't relax for even a moment. His ear should be on the smallest sound, his eye on the smallest movement. Keeping watch wasn't just physical alertness, it was also a mental battle. Sleep was the greatest enemy. The monotony and silence of night would slowly numb a person. Kurg was doing small things to stay awake. Splashing cold water on his face, moving slightly where he sat, keeping his mind busy with hunting memories or dreams about the future. Time passed very slowly. It was as if the night would never end. In the middle of the night, he heard a sound from afar that he had never heard before. This was a deep, bone-shaking roar. It was different from a hyena howl or bear growl. This was the sound of a massive creature, perhaps the sound a woolly mammoth made in danger. Kurg looked anxiously in the direction the sound came from. The presence of such a large animal could change the balances in the region. This meant both a threat and a potential hunting opportunity. The great mammoth hunt stories the shaman had told came to his mind. Those legendary hunts where dozens of hunters, after days of tracking, had cornered a massive mammoth. Perhaps one day he too could be part of such a hunt. The sounds of night reminded Kurg that the world wasn't just made up of them. They were just a small part of this massive and wild world. A danger could arise at any moment from anywhere. But at the same time, this world was full of incredible opportunities and wonders. Keeping watch wasn't just about protecting the clan, it was also a moment of contemplation when humans understood their place in nature, their fragility, and their strength. When dawn began to break, when the sky slowly brightened, Kurg felt a deep relief. They had gotten through another night without incident. The clan had slept safely thanks to his watch. He handed over his duty to the next watchman who came to his side. He curled up in his own sleeping place with fatigue. As he closed his eyes, the sounds of night were still ringing in his ears. These sounds were the music of his world. Life was a constant struggle, and one of the greatest fronts of this struggle was waged against their own bodies. In an age without medical science, even the simplest wound or illness could be fatal. The human body was both their most valuable asset and their greatest weakness. This morning, one of the clan's oldest hunters, Guard, woke up with a severe cough. His cough was dry and deep. He was having difficulty breathing. There was a pain in his chest. The clan's healer, that is, the shaman, immediately came to his side. The shaman wasn't just a sorcerer who spoke with spirits. He was also a physician who understood the language of plants. He knew which of hundreds of plants relieved pain, which stopped bleeding, which lowered fever. This knowledge had accumulated over generations through observation and trial and error. The shaman listened to Guard's chest. He placed his hand on his forehead to check his fever. The situation looked serious. The shaman took out a handful of dry leaves from the leather bag beside him. He began to steep these leaves in a container filled with hot water. A sharp-smelling herbal tea emerged. This tea was believed to soften the chest and ease breathing. Guard drank the tea with difficulty. Everyone was watching him anxiously. Losing an experienced member of the clan meant not just losing a friend, but also losing his knowledge and memory. Injuries were an even more common problem. A cut received during a hunt, a fracture occurring from a fall could create a life-threatening situation. Infection was the greatest enemy. When a wound became inflamed, there was no antibiotic to stop it. The healer would use the sap of certain plants or ash to clean wounds. Spider webs were utilized to stop bleeding. A broken arm or leg would be straightened and tried to be stabilized by wrapping it with tree bark and leather strips. But these treatments didn't always work. Sometimes, despite the best efforts, the wound would get infected and the person would slowly die in agony. That's why everyone had to take very good care of their bodies. Being careful, avoiding unnecessary risks were fundamental rules of survival. Toothache was another common and painful problem. A rotten tooth could cause unbearable pain. It could even lead to death if the infection entered the bloodstream. The only treatment was to break or pull out the problematic tooth, generally with no anesthesia, by striking it with a hard object. This was an incredibly painful procedure. Child deaths were also very common. Perhaps only a few out of every 10 children born could reach adulthood. Those born weak, those defenseless against diseases, couldn't last long in this merciless world. Though this was a great source of sadness for the clan, it was accepted as a natural part of life. Only the strongest and most resilient survived. Guard's condition confronted everyone in the clan with their own fragility. When Kurg saw his father, who had once been the clan's strongest hunter, lying so weak and defenseless, he felt a wave of sadness. He thought that one day he too might be in the same situation. Life hung by a thin thread, and this thread could break at any moment. After the shaman gave Guard the herbal tea to drink, he also applied a poultice made of some crushed leaves to his chest. Then he began his ritual. Shaking a rattle in his hand and singing in a monotonous voice, it was believed he was trying to drive out the evil spirits in Guard's body. For them, illness wasn't just a physical condition. It was also the work of an evil spirit that had entered the body. That's why treatment was both herbal and spiritual. Throughout the day, clan members took turns waiting beside Guard. They gave him water to drink, covered him. This wasn't just care for a patient, it was also a demonstration of the clan's solidarity. When one fell, the others tried to lift him up. Supporting each other was the only way to survive with these fragile bodies. Whether Guard would survive or not was uncertain. This depended on his body's strength and the effectiveness of the shaman's treatment. But the clan had done everything it could. The rest was left to nature's and the spirit's will. The clan's life was tightly bound to the merciless but regular cycle of seasons. For them, the calendar was the movements of the sun and moon in the sky, the growth of plants, and the migration of animals. Each season brought its own unique challenges and opportunities. The long and bountiful summer days were slowly giving way to autumn's coolness. Days were getting shorter, nights were getting longer and colder. The leaves of trees were turning from green to yellow, then to red. This was a warning sign for the clan. The harsh winter was approaching, and time to prepare was running out. Every morning, Bor would go out to the cave's mouth and carefully examine the sky and surroundings. He would check whether birds had started to migrate, whether the wind's direction had changed. These were clues to the sky's signs about how harsh the winter would be. This year, migratory bird flocks had set out south early. This wasn't a good sign. The clan's elders were whispering that this was the harbinger of a long and harsh winter. This information started a silent bustle in the clan. Winter preparations became the most important activity on which the clan focused all its energy. Hunters began going out on hunts more frequently and for longer durations than normal. Their aim wasn't just to find daily food, but also to store meat by drying or freezing it for winter. After a successful hunt, part of the meat would be cut into thin strips and hung from the cave ceiling to be dried with smoke. This smoked meat could last for months without spoiling. The gathering women were also in a feverish work state. They were collecting autumn's last blessings, especially long-lasting hard-shelled nuts like hazelnuts and acorns. These nuts would be one of the most important food sources in terms of protein and fat during winter. Additionally, making a fuel wood stock was of vital importance. The clan's young people spent their days in the forest collecting dry branches and fallen trees. A corner of the cave had turned into a massive woodpile. This woodpile was the fuel for the fire that would keep them alive during winter's freezing cold. Kurg actively participated in every stage of these preparations. He carried wood, went hunting, collected nuts. He knew that everyone needed to do their best. In the middle of winter, when snow covered everything and game animals disappeared, these preparations would be their only assurance. The preparations weren't limited to just food and fuel. Clothing and shelter also needed to be made ready for winter. Women were processing the hides of animals hunted in summer, sewing new furs, or repairing old ones. The cave's mouth was being closed more tightly with large animal hides to cut the wind and snow. The cycle of seasons also taught them the cyclical nature of time. Life had an end and a beginning. Winter was a kind of death. Nature would fall asleep. Everything would freeze. But after every winter, spring would come. The sun would warm again. Snows would melt. Plants would revive again, and animals would return. This cycle gave them hope even in the most difficult times. No matter how harsh winter passed, they knew spring would eventually come. This cyclical understanding also shaped their beliefs and rituals. In autumn, before entering winter, offerings would be made to nature's spirits. This was both a thanks for the past summer's abundance and a plea for help against the coming winter's difficulties. The shaman would conduct these rituals, trying to ensure the clan's harmony with nature. The sky signs whispered to them not just the weather, but also the rhythm of life. Reading those signs correctly and acting accordingly determined the fine line between survival and extinction. The clan was preparing for the approaching winter as one body, trusting in this ancient wisdom learned from their ancestors. They knew that if they worked together, they could get through even the darkest and coldest days. The clan's smallest members, the children, managed to create a world of play for themselves even in the middle of these feverish winter preparations. Their laughter and joyful shouts brought a momentary smile to the anxious faces of the adults. However, their games weren't just innocent fun. Each game was actually a serious lesson, preparing them for their future roles. Male children were playing with small blunt-tipped spears carved by their fathers and uncles. Their targets were tree logs, large leaves, or sometimes each other. During this game, they were learning how to hold the spear, how to aim, and how to throw. While chasing each other, they were developing the agility and speed a hunter needed to have. When they fell to the ground and scraped their knees, they were learning to endure pain. This was the first and most basic lesson of hunting school. Kurg sometimes watched these games and remembered his own childhood. He too had played the same games, dreamed the same dreams. Now the games had turned into reality. The spear in his hand was no longer a toy, but a deadly weapon. His target wasn't a tree log, but a living and dangerous animal. The line between game and reality was actually very thin. Female children were imitating their mothers and the clan's other women. They were making clothes for their dolls by tying small leather pieces together, offering colored stones and flowers they had collected to each other as if they were food. They were raking the earth with miniatures of sticks used for digging up roots. Through these games, they were learning the basics of gathering, childcare, and social relations within the clan. The games they established with each other taught them sharing, cooperation, and resolving disagreements. Sometimes male and female children would play together. One of their favorite games was the clan game. They would choose one of themselves as leader, one as shaman, some as hunters, and others as gatherers. In a rock hollow that was a small copy of the cave, they would imitate the adults' lives. This game enabled them to internalize the clan's social structure and that everyone had a role. The learning process wasn't just about games. Children spent a large part of the day beside the adults, watching them carefully. A child would sit beside his father and watch for hours how he chipped a flint. During this time, he would engrave into his memory which stone to use, how to strike the hammer, how to shape the stone. A female child would go to the forest with her mother and see which plants she collected, how she distinguished poisonous ones. In a world where learning by trial and error would be very dangerous, this was the safest and most effective education method: observation and imitation. No one asked them to do anything. They instinctively felt the desire to imitate their elders. When a child tried to chip a tool for the first time or recognized an edible root for the first time, this was a small victory for the clan. This was proof that knowledge had been successfully transferred to the next generation. The clan's continuity depended on this silent education process. Children were the clan's future. Their healthy growth and learning of survival skills was everyone's common responsibility. That's why even when food was scarce, children were always given priority. They weren't just innocent and joyful beings. They were also symbols of the clan's immortality. Play and reality were intertwined in their world. The game they played today would be the very struggle they would give to survive tomorrow. and they were preparing for this harsh reality with laughter and joy. When winter's first snowflakes began to fall, Guard's cough had gotten even worse. The shaman's all efforts, herbal teas and rituals, hadn't been able to stop the disease's progression. Guard could no longer get up from his bed. He was barely breathing. The clan was helplessly watching one of their experienced hunters slowly waste away before their eyes. Death was an inevitable part of life. Every day they encountered it in a hunt, in a predator's attack, or with an illness. But the death of someone, especially a loved and respected member of the clan, always created sadness and emptiness. Kurg spent his last days beside his father. He gave him water to drink, moved his bed closer to the fire so he could benefit from the fire's warmth. Guard could no longer speak, he only communicated with his eyes. Kurg saw in his father's eyes the memories of all those years he had lived, the excitement of hunts, the love he felt for his family, and now also the acceptance of the approaching end. One morning when Kurg woke up, he realized his father was no longer breathing. His chest wasn't rising and falling. The last warmth surrounding his body had also disappeared. Guard had left this world silently while sleeping. A deep silence fell inside the cave. Guard's wife began to cry silently. Tears streamed down the deep wrinkles on her cheeks. The other clan members respectfully gathered around the family. This wasn't a loud mourning. It was inner, silent, and deep. Death was an end, but it was also part of the cycle. The clan showed respect to its dead. They wouldn't just leave them and go. Guard's body was wrapped in his best furs. His favorite spear and a few sharp flint tools were placed beside him. This was so he could continue hunting in the next world, in the realm of spirits. According to them, there was a life after death, and the spirits of their ancestors continued to protect the clan. For the funeral ceremony, a small hollow previously used for burials near the cave was chosen. Guard's body was carefully carried there by the clan's men. As Kurg carried his father's lifeless body, he noticed how light he had become. Only a shadow remained of that strong hunter. The body was placed in the hollow, in a side-lying position with knees drawn to the stomach, the position of the womb. This both symbolized a rebirth and took up less space. Red ochre paint was sprinkled over the body. Red was the color of blood and life. This was a ritual done to give life again to the dead person, to prepare him for the next life. Finally, the hollow's mouth was closed with large stones. This was both to protect the body from scavengers and to ensure the spirit wasn't disturbed. When the ceremony ended, everyone silently returned to the cave. Guard's empty place reminded everyone of his absence, but life had to continue. There wasn't much time to mourn. Winter was pressing, and the life struggle of those who survived was continuing. Kurg felt different that night sitting by the fire. It was as if a part of him had been torn away with his father's death, but at the same time he felt a new responsibility on his shoulders. He was now the family's oldest male. He had to use everything he had learned from his father for the clan's good now. This was part of the cycle. The old died, the young took their place. Knowledge and experience passed from father to son, from mother to daughter. Bodies died, but the clan continued to live. Guard's body had mixed with the earth, but his spirit and memories would continue to live in the clan's stories and in Kurg's heart. This was the merciless but meaningful end of the cycle. Inside the cave, the fire was slowly turning to ash under the control of the night's last watchman. The clan was in a deep sleep. The day's fatigue, the bustle of winter preparations, and the sadness of Guard's death had exhausted everyone. Inside the cave, there was only the sound of sleeping bodies and the fire's crackling. Outside, the world had been covered with a pure white blanket. Winter was beginning to make itself fully felt. The sky was clear and open. Millions of stars adorned the sky with cold and bright light. This was a view of a world without modern light pollution, where humans came face to face with the infinity of the universe. Kurg couldn't sleep. He slowly got up from his bed and walked to the cave's mouth, taking care not to wake anyone. The watchman greeted him with a nod when he saw him. Kurg sat on a rock without minding the freezing cold outside and began to watch the sky. He didn't know what those bright points were. He couldn't even imagine how far away they were, how big they were. But looking at those stars gave him peace. He felt how small a part of this massive universe he was. His own troubles, the clan's problems, hunger, cold, all of these seemed to lose their meaning in that infinite silence under those stars. He thought of his father. Was his spirit now in one of those stars? Was he watching them from there together with the clan's other ancestors? This thought gave Kurg consolation. He wasn't alone. There were the spirits of his ancestors who protected him, guided him. The clan's life consisted of a series of cycles. Day and night, summer and winter, birth and death, everything was in constant motion. One day the hunt would be successful, the next day they would return empty-handed. One day healthy, the next day sick. This uncertainty was the basic reality of their lives. But within these cycles, there was one thing that didn't change: the clan itself. Individuals came and went, but the clan continued to exist. Each newborn baby was a herald of this continuity. Each learning child was a guarantee of the future. Kurg looked at his clan. There, inside that cave, the future of humanity was sleeping. They were neither a kingdom nor an empire, but their survival struggle, their keeping the fire, their transferring knowledge, their loves and losses were everything that made humans human in its purest, most basic form. They were the beginning of the story. When the sun's first rays began to create a faint brightness on the horizon, Kurg stood up. A new day was beginning. No one knew what today would bring. Perhaps a hunt, perhaps a storm. But whatever it was, they would face it together. He returned to the cave. He lay down in his own place. When he closed his eyes, in his mind there was neither the excitement of the hunt nor the sadness of death. Only that deep, meaningful silence under the stars and the simple truth of life that had to continue. The life of an average cave dweller was this: simple, difficult, merciless, but at the same time meaningful and deep. This was the purest, most basic story of survival. And thus we witnessed a day tens of thousands of years ago. A cycle extending from dawn's cold to night's starry silence. This wasn't the story of great victories or monumental structures. This was the story of people who united in fire's warmth, awakened the stone's soul, trusted in the earth's generosity and the sky's signs. The story of a clan trying to exist in fragile bodies, in a merciless world, understanding each other with silent languages, drawing their spirits on walls, and most importantly, clinging to each other to reach the next day. Their life, far from modern world's complexity, was focused on the most basic elements of survival. And this simple but deep struggle laid the foundation for everything that exists today. They were the common ancestors of us all, the nameless heroes of humanity's story.